This was the start of our patrol into the northwest of Tari in 1955, May, June, and it shows Jim Sinclair and I starting out on the patrol, in which we went through the Lavani Valley and into up as far as Lake Kopiago, and then down to Lavani Valley and into Lavani Valley. Now, the purpose of this patrol was to establish a base camp for further exploration of the areas northwest of Tari. This film now shows our patrol setting out, and some of our camps in the Paru Valley. This was our first one out of Hedamari. We left Tari and went carried our goods through to Hedamari, and from Hedamari into the Paru Valley. It was the Paru people that were first contacted by us. They had previous contact, I believe, with some of the people of Hydes O'Malley exploration, but this is a very vague sort of recollection that they had, and to most of them we were the first whites that they'd seen, and certainly the first large government patrol that went through. In the Paru, of course, it was necessary for us to buy cow, sweet potato and vegetables to feed our large carrier line and their police guards, and so the medium of trade here was salt, giri shell and face paint, rouge. The Paru people were first of all a bit reluctant to come down to trade with us. However, after a great deal of persuasion, the women folk usually bought back some of their produce and sold it to us. The young men of the patrol contacted the young men of the Paru Adzagari area, and we're now in the Adzagari, where later on we established quite a big camp. The Adzagari people were not as friendly as the Paru people towards us, but they did want to investigate what we had to offer in the way of trade, and so it was here that we did make and did contact quite a number of the people. It was here that Jim Sinclair, who's pictured here, was able to get quite a lot of his anthropological data and record the disposition of the tribes that made up the Adzagari Paru people. Looming far above the clouds there are the peaks above Kopiago, which was our destination on this patrol, and you see the shots approaching, and here we had an airdrop of supplies, which we received this at a place called Koruba, where we built a rest house. It was here that we made a base camp, and it was also here at this stage that the patrol carriers, dealing with the patrol report, they left us here, and they would not carry any further because the country further known to them, and it was said to contain bad spirits, and so the people were not disposed to carry further. And so it was from this point that we had to recruit other carriers and subsequently stage our carry line so that we could only move forward. Instead of for about 4 or 5 hours march a day, we could only move forward for 2 to 3, and then go back and collect the more supplies and move it up in staging. Quite a wearisome progress, and slowed us down considerably. We would have been able to have got the patrol over much quicker and easier had we been able to carry through with the one set of patrol carriers. As I said, it was here that we built the first permanent rest house in the Duna area, as this area was called, and we had to teach, our police line had to teach the people how to thatch and how to tie on the rafters, and because they build only small houses, and they're not up in the air like ours was. Here we have a man showing us how his matches worked, and he's making fire. using a strip of bamboo skin and a forked stick with dry tinder in the middle of the fork, and the friction, and then a spark is formed, and they blow on the spark and get the fire, and it is just as quick as carrying it out here to get the fire going. Of course, matches puts an end to all that sort of thing. Again, we're looking now towards the area of Lake Kopiago, which was our destination on this patrol, and the mountains are coming closer, as you can see in these shots. It was here that there was a gorge down which the Tumbutu River flowed, and subsequently went under limestone cliffs. And these were the people around a small lake area who had obviously had very little contact with European, if any, and we rather thought that they had not had any contact. The interpreter said that we were the first white people that they had seen. The Australian flag, which was our mark of authority, goes up, and here's Philip in the medical tent getting ready for the dressings, examining and admiring a stone axe, which was the implements that these people used. And now we're in the lake, at Lake Kopiago itself. And Lake Kopiago had a mass of floating islands, and sometimes the whole surface of the water would be covered with islands, and at other times these would drift over to the edge and leave a wide expanse of water free. The lakes were quite big. The biggest one was probably 5 acres in extent, and it was quite springy underneath, but you could walk on it, and there were snakes and ducks in galore on this island. It was a beautiful place, the lake, set in the hills and deep in this valley. And these are some of the hills around the lake. As you can see, the bluff above it, which was our landmark, to which we marched for days before we reached Lake Kopiago. And these were the people dancing. They had an impromptu dance for us, and this was to show, we presumed, the joy at our coming, but we don't know, it may have been for some other purpose. Sinclair spent his time, of course, bringing his books up to date and getting data from the people, and whilst the medical men had the task of repairing the day's walking damage to the carriers and the police, and to the local people who came in. It was odd that the talk of medicine had preceded the patrol, and the people were quite keen to take advantage of medicine. For a while I thought it might have been just because they wanted to get clean bandages to use for headdresses, which were very popular, but in fact they did seek to have arrow wounds extracted, teeth extracted, and all manners of dressings. This was one of the tambu signs. We were now left the lake and we're coming down towards Lavani Valley, and actually that mark was a tambu sign which meant that we were not welcome to come further down into the valley, but we did cross the mountain range and went down in. And the reason that the people in Lavani did not want us in there was the fact that they do have, or we understood this to be the fact that they had an oil seepage, which was a traditional trading item, which they traded out to the Huri and the Duna people for body paint, for Sing Sing purposes, and they oiled their bodies with this oil. Now, we did not see on this patrol the actual oil seepage, because we did not think it was politic to press the people to see this source of supply, but I understand that Sinclair, at a subsequent patrol, did see it, and found that it was where oil does come up out of the ground. These are some of the typical houses of Lavani, which are very small. They're not. They wouldn't be more than 4 foot above the ground at the ridge cap height, and very dark and virtually airtight, and filled with smoke. And you entered those at your own risk, because there were a lot of house lice in them, and I'm afraid it was most uncomfortable. The Lavani Valley was a big, wide valley, about 13 miles across by about 13 miles long by about 8 miles across. That was at its widest points, and the Tumbutu River springs up in the valley and feeds a series of lakes, and then flows out under the limestone ridges in a series of caverns to come out on the other side into the Duna, and then flow down through the Duna, meet the Paru, and subsequently reach the Strickland Gorge. The weather in Lavani was extremely cold, and we had actually several falls of hail while we were there, and making it very unpleasant. Sinclair had the task of finding a site for an airstrip and a station, and it was his duty to get out and measure all the possible airstrip sites, and consequently he'd go out in the morning, and whilst I stayed in the camp, being the medical assistant, I would stay in the camp and treat the people who came and try to establish friendly relations. Sinclair on this patrol took a number of still photographs, a lot of which were published in subsequent publications, and as I was strictly an amateur with my movie at this time, this was the first time that I'd used it. Some of the shots, of course, are jerky and repetitive, but I tried here to get a panoramic view of the Lavani Valley, and to show the extent of the ranges that separate it from the rest of the country. And these ranges are all round, and they are precipitous and go up to about 12,000 feet. The floor of the valley is around about the 7,000 feet above sea level, and it is extremely cold. There are wild violets in profusion, and it's a marshy bed, not at all my vision of a Shang-ri-La. However, it did have beauty, and some of the cliffs were sheer limestone. The people from the Paru Valley came into here, which proved that it was not an isolated place, that they did come in to trade for their oil and to bring whatever trade items they exchanged for that oil into the valley. Some of it would be tobacco, and some would be possum fur, and different items of trade they would bring in and get their bamboo full of oil, and away they'd travel back home. So this trade had been going on for quite a number of years. They were, it wasn't a wide open area, it was a bit of an event to go into Lavani to get the oil. Philip Bogembo of the Northern District came with me as a clerical assistant medical orderly, and Perry Barreau, and this shows Perry here dressing the sores, and this shows one old man salvaging a bandage so to use as a head decorations. And some of the what we called boss boys, they were the fight leaders, and they had actually come in with us, accompanied us in to have a look at what we were doing in that area, and they were the strong men of the Hedamari clan and the Paru people. Again, the cliffs and the tent strips, we carried calico strips. These would be, I suppose, 12 foot long, 12 to 18 foot long, and each man carried a calico strip. And this was then strung together over a pole, and that provided a fly to keep the rain out for the carriers at night. It saved carrying massive tent flies, which were heavy, and the calico is, once it gets impregnated with smoke, which is not very long, it becomes quite waterproof. And so they, as I said, each man of a morning carried his own, rolled up his own roll of calico, put it on top of his pack, and marched for the day, and then at night they were strung over a pole and they formed the tent fly in which they slept. Again, these shots are an attempt to show the height of the ranges around the floor, from the floor of the valley looking up. And as you can see, they're heavily timbered and they're quite steep. It was interesting that it was over these ranges that the first glimpse of the valley was caught, and this was statically hailed as another Shang-ri-La, a lost tribe that had no connection with the outside world and living in idyllic surroundings of idyllic nature. And there was a lot of hogwash in the press at the time, subsequently proved incorrect by patrols such as this. People wherever we went were curious, and we travelled from one end of the valley to the other, setting up, I think in all we set up 3 camps in the valley, so that we could have a look at the various terrain and to judge whether there were different peoples at each end of the valley. But it seemed that they were all closely related and interrelated, and that was one tribe. The sunsets at Lavani were really beautiful, and late evening, if the clouds hadn't come down and blotted out everything, which was often the case. The people here do not have great land wealth, and the land is not rich, so they subsistence levels of food is provided also by nuts from the tree, and that is the Koruba nut or the pandanus nut, which they harvest. This was a man who had a very badly injured hand, which later had to be amputated, and he had injured that with a tree falling on it, and some weeks before we got there. This was a man cutting tree leaves for the signal fires for the airdrops. As I said, we had several airdrops on this patrol to keep us going, and supplies came in from Madang into Tari, and then were packed into patrol packs and dropped out over our camp area. Leaving Lavani, we came out the other side down towards the site that is now the Koruba airstrip, and this was in that area at Koruba where we now have established this camp. The Koruba people brought in pigs for us, and these were purchased for an axe or for shell. They were shot and cleaned and provided fresh protein meat for the carriers and police. This was the pig getting roasted, the hair roasted off it prior to carving up. And Punga, the interpreter from Tari who had come with us, was the old master of ceremonies at all of these festivities. And this was approaching what is now Koruba station site and airstrip site. Well, these people followed us, and as I was bringing up the rear of the patrol, I was a bit wary about what they were, and as they all had bows and arrows, nothing untoward happened, and all it was that they were very pleased to see us coming there, and they wanted us to build this station at Koruba in that area. And so ultimately, of course, this was where the station was built. They bought us plenty of food and told us that this would provide a better station than Tari, and that we should certainly come and stay amongst them. And as I said, this was the site that was ultimately selected to be the base camp for future patrol activities and pacification in the Duna area. Leaving this area, we came down onto the Huri swamps, and we thought that might be a site for an airstrip, but it was a very swampy area. However, the quality of the cow was very good, and the patrol carriers were very happy to be encamped there. This was some of the cow being purchased, and the lions had come in, sit down and put the cow in front of them and hold out their hands with leaves to get either paint or shell or salt in exchange for the cow. While all this was going on, the medical tents were being erected and the routine work of the patrol carried out. Some of the young men here wanted paint, and they were all conscious of the fact because they'd seen themselves in a mirror for the first time, and they were conscious of the fact that paint was a really good adornment, and so they preferred to get the paint in exchange. These were some young men, the Iguri Minas, the young men initiates, and they were dressed and oiled, their bodies oiled, probably with Lavani oil, and carrying a traditional sign at the back. And this was crossing the Huri swamps, where trees had to be felled to cross to provide a footbridge to allow the patrol to cross the open rivers, or open drains that ran through the swamp. Now, most of that is grass over swampy water. And that was Sergeant Major Kumbupu, Philip Bogembo, and a man with a bad toothache, showing us the tooth, and Jim Sinclair getting ready to take some photographs of the camp erection. This was a man with a bad leprosy, eroded hand. He is wearing a typical necklace of giri, and this was myself trying to give this fellow some pain relief in taking out his tooth. We did it with the injection of anaesthetic and then pulled the tooth, and they were amazed that the tooth was out. And this was coming back in towards Tari through the traditional fight ditches that were a landmark everywhere in Tari, that the gardens were connected by these ditches, and this allowed people to walk unobserved from garden to garden, so that the warriors couldn't readily pick out the movement of the people. And this is coming from down into Hedamari, into the valley where Hedamari base camp had been established, in which we were later to build up to quite a size, and that showed that buildings around Hedamari. It consisted purely of a rest house. Later on we built a huge store, and we extended the road, which now is the motor road to, I think the present motor road bypasses Hedamari, but it was the one road that went through there at that time. I think there's been a better surveyed track found since then, and it bypasses. This is again a medicine tent, giving out first aid and drugs and dressings. And this was the establishment of the big store at Hedamari, building the big store to hold the cargo that was necessary to complete a station on a transit. And this was our patrol coming into Tari airstrip. Sinclair had made a forced march and gone in before us, and we came in with the rest of the carriers and some of the people that had accompanied the patrol. And this was at Tari airstrip with Dr. Todd, taking photographs of some of the men that had come in with us. And that was the houses of the medical staff at Tari, which we had left some months before. And this is the Tari medical setup. The mountain range, and Mount Tigger and Mount I cannot recall the other name of the mountain, but it's the two mountains that flying from Mendi, you pass over before you come down into the Tari Valley. And this was a typical road scene at Tari, again with the painted initiates. They always walked in groups of 4 or 5, usually with an older man or 2 looking after them. And they had well-oiled bodies with nice leaves and face paint adornment. And this was a Gibbs Sepik Norseman, Airways Norseman, landing at Tari. And Tari airstrip was only a very small airstrip in those days. And this was when I flew out from Tari over to Mendi and went away on leave. And this was some of the roads snaking out towards Huevio from Tari, and ultimately trying to get into to Mendi. These were the ranges over which, as I said, the planes flew. Mount Doma and Mount Tigger, I think, were the 2 mountains that were there, over which we flew, and they were up about, I think, nearly 12,000 feet above sea level. This is coming down the other side of those mountain ranges. And this was at Mendi Station, where I spent about 3 or 4 days giving our report to the District Commissioner on what we had located and seen. And we were the guests of the District Commissioner at the District Commissioner's house. That was his wife, Mrs. Cole, and his son, Robert Cole. And Robert was flying his kite, and Kay was looking after him. And this was Mrs. Cole and the son coming up to the house, which was only newly completed in the time, and Mrs. Cole's mother was staying with her at that period. And then we left, and that was the end of the patrol.